We've been previously looking at shading plaster cast-like matte items by looking closely and identifying what is in light and what is in shade, and simply putting a tone of value over everything we perceive as shaded. We preserve our lights and simply darken our drawing. This is how painting a watercolor painting generally proceeds, because you cannot really lighten what you have darkened. I like this fact because it forces us to intensely scrutinize our subject more closely, determining precisely what we want in light or shade early on in the rendering, because we can't correct our mistakes. We shall also later see how drawing or painting might proceed using opaques, when we can darken values but then actually make them light again. This is a slightly different approach to what we've been doing so far. First, let's use our current structural procedure for drawing transparent and shiny objects. Reflections and transparency are strange. How strange to be able to see through a substance. How strange to look at an object and see the world reflected back at you. This must be key to the fascination with luster and translucency. It is difficult to describe form with light and shade with transparency and reflection, so it is somewhat different from drawing a matte object that is lit. But not so different that if we simply focus on identifying and rendering the shapes of values from light to dark as perceived in the reflections and distortions. Let's look at how we might proceed to make a drawing something like this. We lightly draw in our subjects transparent and shiny globes. Once again, this is just with a line drawing. Once again, I've provided myself with a value swatch from black to white, top right. I will look closely and decide what I want to leave as light. That is the tone of the paper. I put a tone over everything else that I don't want to leave white. This is no longer obviously a matter of quote unquote deciding what is in light and what is in shadow. This is now better thought of as in a more abstract sense. It is simply a question of what do we want brightly lit and what do we want to have value or tone on. We continue to look closely at our subject and its values. With a second tone, we now have a total of 3 values: white of the paper, a lighter tone, and a mid-tone. And we're starting to get a sense of the elusive, transparent and shiny forms of our subjects. We add another tone. We add a final tone, putting in our darkest darks. As usual, I enjoy using the sharp end of my crayon to do some nuancing and darkening of the darkest dark tones through hatching. I'm finished. If you're in my metal jewelry design or rendering class, you will almost certainly be working with watercolor at some point, and I hope some of you in my regular drawing classes will give washes a try, particularly if you have the materials on hand. If you use washes, your light accurate drawing is established. Once your light accurate drawing is established, you can quickly build up tones and create gradations using a pigment loaded brush alongside a water loaded brush. And you can soften edges to create the sort of with the water loaded brush to create the sort of gradations you find in objects of luster. By mixing ultramarine and burnt sienna watercolor, a neutral grey can be mixed, or warmer or cooler washes. Subsequently, if there is color in your lustrous objects, you can glaze watercolor on top in transparent washes to achieve a convincing appearance, perhaps silver with colored reflections, or perhaps lustrous metals that actually have a color like brass or gold. We spend quite a bit of time in the jewelry class rendering shiny and transparent and very sparkly objects because that is what jewelry students will be designing. But any drawer or painter should be transfixed by the ambiguous glitter, ambiguous shimmer of all that glitters, gold or not. Let's demonstrate laying down washes instead of tones with the side of a crayon. For the wash drawing, I put a tone over everything that I perceive not to be in a bright light. I then add another, slightly darker valued tone over everything that is a little darker. Fairly careful analysis is required, although reflections are fudgy. You don't have to be so exact in your drawing or shading as you would be drawing a portrait. You can be a lot more suggestive. Another darker value wash is added. This has a loose, sketchy feel that, for watercolor, might suffice for a finished, fairly high-key, light sketch. But I add another tonal wash. Things look close to resolved now. But I add one more darker valued series of washes over parts of the globes. Each subsequent wash has covered less and less area, of course, because of the reductive nature of this kind of painting. Things to note: a transparent and translucent ball are really more or less the same. A transparent or translucent ball is really more or less the same as a shiny ball, except it's kind of higher key. It's lighter in value. And there are some shapes created by being able to see through the globe rather than just seeing surface reflections. But they do appear very similar. Remember in our earlier drawing sessions we looked at wide-angle lens and a 4-point perspective that required a curving distortion, both latitudinally and longitudinally? Same thing applies here. We want our shapes to curve around, the shapes in our reflections to curve around as they actually do on a globe, because looking into a shiny orb is pretty much similar to looking through a wide-angle GoPro type of lens. As well, I don't want to make my shiny or transparent globe look like a distorted window on the world. So in both the crayon drawing and the wash painting, I've made some effort to simplify the shapes reflected on the surfaces. This makes each of the balls look more, makes them look less like looking through a lens. M.C. Escher wanted his shiny ball to reflect everything in the world in great detail. I don't, and for these exercises, you almost certainly won't. So this is a good reason to kind of simplify what is reflected in the ball. You don't want to create a kind of a distorted window. One other thing. This demo was done in my studio. This is not ideal in terms of the design, so to speak, of the reflections. They are overly complex, despite my trying to pare them down and make them simpler and more vague. This is because there is a lot of clutter or visual noise in my studio. Here's a quote-unquote airbrushed shiny object I rendered quickly as a demo in Photoshop. In a way, it looks shinier than the watercolor due to its simplicity, as well perhaps because of the subtler gradations and greater contrasts between light and dark. The darks are very dark. When jewelers and jewelry students and product photographers photograph their work, they go to great lengths to simplify the reflections, eliminate that visual noise, so to speak, in their subjects by creating a space with no interference. A light box or a carefully simply arranged studio, for example. This creates a kind of simpler magic realism in terms of reflections. Product photography demands broad, simple strokes to create a kind of hyper luster. The jewelers need to do this to reflect well on their creations. The same applies in advertising. Not only is product photography reductive and simplifying reflections, but artists are then usually employed to digitally airbrush and pare down the reflective patterns even more. They do this with everything from cans and bottles to ice cubes. Advertising consists of hidden persuasions and not so hidden persuasions, using our fears and particularly our desires. And what could have a greater appeal to our desire to quench our thirst more than an image of something that looks magically liquidly hyperreal and chill in terms of its physical sensuousness? Remember we looked at how Renaissance artists made grisaille monochrome underpaintings that they added color to? These monochrome watercolors are underpaintings of sorts, and you can apply this discernment of what is in light and what is in shade with washes to figures, to objects, or landscape. Here is a streetscape in a monochrome grisaille, and here is some local color applied transparently on top. In a watercolor painting course, I would be encouraging a great deal of time to be devoted to painting in monochrome as a way to practice brushwork and modeling form and to segue from drawing to painting. Let's leave watercolor and go back to a drawing material, charcoal this time, and I want to briefly outline a variation of the exercises we've been doing that corresponds more closely with painting with oil or acrylic, that is, using opaques rather than transparent watercolor. Charcoal erases easily with a kneaded eraser, and you can use the eraser almost like you are using a white crayon or paint. An approach to working in opaque is to do what we often did in animation background painting. We put a mid to light tone on our paper in the color range of what we wish to have represented in a scene. We would darken darks, we would darken darks again, much like we did in the last exercise. But of course, we have not preserved the white of the paper, so we would then come in with an opaque light and lighten lights. Then we'd introduce some local color and apply our darkest darks and finally our lightest lights, our highlights. What I'm going to demonstrate now is a simple analogous process similar to this using charcoal, which has no color, only value. I put a mid-tone over the whole paper, using my hand to smudge it around. I make my line drawing on what is now toned paper. I apply a layer of tone with lighter lights. I have just 3 values. The tone of the paper and 2 values of shadow. And now I use the eraser to create a 4th tone, which is much like applying an opaque light toned paint. I might have brushed the charcoal around a bit and applied a bit more here as well. As I tried to resolve the drawing. Finally, I put in darkest darks and perhaps will pull out some of the lightest lights with the eraser to more fully resolve and describe the describing of form in the drawing. I created the tone on the paper with charcoal. Here's a drawing I found online of an atelier style drawing using specially toned or colored paper. The process is similar. This is presumably done with Conte crayon, black or bisque to start with, and darken darks, and then a white crayon is used to pull out the highlights. Here's another drawing I found online showing the initial drawing of darks in black or bisque Conte, and then a drenching white dazzling light has been applied to create the highlights. I hope you can clearly see that in all these exercises and illustrated variations here, there's a clear structural approach to both the analysis and rendering of form. As you draw and internalize more and more of this structural approach, less and less of your conscious mind will concern itself with these structures as they'll be deployed or ignored lyrically and intuitively. Your conscious mind will have room to focus on more complex concerns. So I'm going to end with a suggestion for some drawing at home. You can draw yourself in a mirror or from photographs, or draw a loved one from life or from photographs. In a way, photographs might be best for this exercise. What you want to do is set your loved one or yourself, it's probably easier with somebody else, up in a window with light pouring through it. Or you could sit in front of a strong artificial light, but the window might be best, particularly if it is not allowing sunlight to flood in. Think of the north light coming from a wall of windows in a classical artist's studio. With your subject sitting by the window, photograph the face of your subject at different angles, straight on, at 3/4 view, and go on to turn your subject's face and play with how the light rakes across the face. Don't get too close with your camera. Step back somewhat and zoom in to crop the face. If you're too close, with most camera lens, they have a degree of wide angle, a kind of a wide angle lens to them, and they'll distort the face. Keep in mind what we covered in the classes on perspective and how zooming out distorts an object or a subject less. I'm using the planes of the head here to quickly illustrate some of the interesting sorts of arrangements you can experiment with for your portraiture. In this one, where is the light coming from? Yep, from the direction of the viewer. What kind of shading or modeling does this suggest or require? Yep, relief. You got it, Pontiac. We covered this earlier. So we can gradually turn our subject's head away from the light as far as we like, creating interesting points of view that use various effects of light and shade to describe the form of the face. If you are not working from a model, you can literally take dozens of photos to scrutinize and decide which are best to practice drawing from.